Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Gavinsky's Tutorials. Today I'm looking at MidiDREAMs and MidiDRUMs by Art Kerns. Now Art Kerns has done a bunch of beautiful MIDI apps, and Art has been kind enough to offer me 5 copies of any of his apps to give away to subscribers to the channel watching this video in the first 2 days of release. All the details of what you've got to do, as usual, are in the pinned comment at the top of the YouTube comments section. As usual, everybody, I say please read that comment carefully because the instructions are not always the same every time. So please read it carefully, follow the instructions. And if you're not familiar with what apps he's got, just take a look at the App Store, Art Kerns, see what's available, and choose which one you would like to win if you're one of the lucky 5 winners. Okay, so in the video today, I'm going to go through MidiDREAMs and MidiDRUMs pretty thoroughly. I'm going to focus on MidiDREAMs. MidiDRUMs has a lot of crossover with it. So when I come to explain MidiDRUMs, I'm not going to explain and show again the various features that are also contained in MidiDREAMs. I'll only focus on the things that are unique to MidiDRUMs. So if you are only interested in MidiDRUMs, you're still going to have to watch the part about MidiDREAMs to get all of the features. I don't want to have to repeat myself there. These are really cool apps. I like these a lot. Fantastic. Now, what I want to say, okay, this video then is going to be basically a video replacement, more or less, for the manual. I'm going to cover pretty much all the main points of the manual, but particularly if you're new to MIDI or new to iOS, I would recommend reading the manual. It's very, very detailed, and it explains a lot that I think would be useful for people who are new to music making on iOS or new to MIDI. And it's just written with a nice style and a lot of attention to detail. I really respect the job that Art does on his manuals. There are actually a couple of little details that are wrong in the manual that don't reflect the current version of the app, but overall it's a great manual. Now, let's just get started here. Let me let you hear a bit of an example of some of these in action. I'll just mention these are monophonic, so if you want polyphony, all you have to do is just use several instances together. So here I've got 3 instances of MidiDREAMs, and these are going into these 3 instances of Korg module in different ways. For example, some of them I'm passing through MIDI gates to reduce the probability of those MIDI events, and putting some things through scalar to bring them down, and so on and so on. I won't go into all the details of this. Just be aware that these 3 are basically being played by instances of MidiDREAMs. And then here I've got a Rosetta FM, or sorry, Rausmacher FM, and that's being played by an instance of MidiDRUMs. And then I've got I Fretless Bass by Blue Mangoo. That is being played by Rosetta Bassline. Now, this sounded good when I was jamming with it a minute ago, but the reality of using these kinds of MIDI tools is, when you then try and play with them again, is it going to sound good? I mean, if you've done something very simple, but if you're doing something like this where there's a little bit of polyrhythmic things going on and stuff, maybe when I bring these in now, it won't sound that good. It really depends on the order you bring them in and what's happening at any particular time. So don't be too harsh on me if this sounds like crap. All right. So I did a video on the Far North pack from Module Pro a while ago. Check that out if you haven't seen it. I'm putting this bass through Bleach Saturator. Also did a video on this. Rosetta bassline I covered when I did a video on Rosetta Suite by Bram Boss. Okay, so it's just to give you a little example of something that we can build up very easily with this. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to switch out to another instance of this, close this session. So first things first, let's look how we route things in our host app. So for example, here I'm using AUM, and I've done a detailed walkthrough video on AUM called Almost Everything You Need to Know About AUM. So you can watch that if you're not too familiar with how AUM works and you want to get to know it better. So when we open up a new channel in AUM, we get this choice, audio, MIDI, or import. So if we want to open up an instance of MidiDREAMs or MidiDRUMs, we click on it and then we click MIDI, and then we can open it up in here. Now, I'm not going to open up an instance in this channel because I've already got some opened up over here. So let's take a little look at the interface and see a couple of things about this. Let me open up a totally new instance just to show you what it's like when you open one up for the first time. So we've opened one up here. Obviously, it's not going to do anything until we send the MIDI somewhere. So if I want to send it into this instance of Pipa, this beautiful clave ground vocal synth, which I reviewed before, we click on this hamburger menu here, or this is one way we can do it anyway, and then we click on the instance of MidiDREAMs that we want to use. For this one, this is MIDI channel 2, and it's number 5, it's the 5th instance, so I'll click on that. And you can see this immediately starts making sound, so when we open up a new instance of MidiDREAMs, by default it sends out a note on the first of 16 steps, and it opens up by default on a 16-step sequence. And by default it's set to C major. We can change these things, and it's just sending out a C note, and when we press here we can see the actual note value, and when we move around here then we're going to get different note values. But let's keep that to a C, and let's open up this step. So now this step is also going to make sound. Now you can hear that at the moment these are heard as two separate C notes, right? It's like ba 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 ba. So what we do here, if we want these to become tied together, we go to this length tab and we just click on this LEN here. And now these sliders now control length. So if I raise this, now you can hear those are tied because this step now has a longer value. It's kind of being slurred together with this one. So that's length tab. Now here we have the velocity tab. So we can lower the velocity or increase it or whatever. And here we have the probability slider, which is the chance that we will hear these notes. So you see here it skipped them. At the moment, there's about a 50% chance of each of these sending out its MIDI data. So this is a cool thing to do to bring some variation into your sequences. Now, obviously, you probably won't want to have just all C notes, right? So what you're going to want to do is go in and set up a few different things. Okay, so you can play around with the note values to get a sequence that you like. You can activate steps by clicking on these buttons. You can turn off steps by depressing them, and then they will be shown as faded out. Now we can use these to look at the next steps, and these are completely inactive at the moment. and we'll activate those later. I'm not going to mess with that now. Another thing here is this. If we click on this, we'll see a bunch of different things here. If we click back here, up here again, we'll go back to this slider view. Now also, if we drag to make the window bigger, then now we can see all of that stuff on one page. So that is very useful. Okay, so we'll go through these 4 lines. Let me explain a few things first, then I'll let you hear some things. So here we can skip steps. If I click here, for example, you can see this first step has turned gray, and it is now no longer part of the sequence. That means that this has now changed from being a 16-note sequence to a 15-note sequence. When it comes to the end, it's going to skip this first one and start on the second step. Now, of course, we can add as many of these as we like. So now 3 steps are being skipped. It's now a 13-note sequence. Okay, I'll let you hear this in a second. Here, we're changing the length of the sequence. So here, it's ending on the 16th step. If I change it to this, then now it's ending on the 8th step. Again, I'll let you hear this in a minute. Here we change the note value of each step of the sequence. It's currently an 8th note. We can make them shorter or longer. Here we change the direction of the sequence. Here we add ratcheting. You'll hear that in action in a minute. Resync will change, it'll push the sequence back to sync it again with the host. Now, it doesn't mean that it's out of sync in terms of BPM or something like that, right? But when we play around with different things like skipping different steps or doing all kinds of different things that you can do with this, the first step of your sequence may no longer start on the first beat of a bar, and you might want it to, so you can use resync to do that, and I'll show you that in action in a minute. This I'll talk about later. Here is where we move between different patterns. We can set up different patterns and move between them, so this can be like a song mode. So let's hear this in action. I'm going to do this using Digitalism by AudioKit. Did a review on this a month or 2 ago, in case you haven't seen that. Very nice little rompler. Okay, so first let me shorten the sequence length. Let's make it an 8-step sequence. Okay, now let me say skip this, for example. So you see now, this is not a rest, it's completely skipping that note. That's different from if I deactivate this. If I deactivate this, this is still an 8-step sequence. This is just a rest note. It's not a played note. But if I use this, it's just skipping these completely. This is now a 6-step sequence. So these can be interesting to play with performatively, as can these lengths. So here we're slowing the whole thing down. Here we're speeding it up. These are the kind of things that when we do these, it can get out of sync like I talked about earlier. So we can use the resync button. So just now it was just resynced with this so that when the host starts the bar, this is also starting at the start of the bar. Okay, direction, so now it's going forwards. Now it's going backwards. This is ping pong. And this will just randomly jump around from one note to another. Let me change it back to forward for now. Ratcheting will double up. It will basically, let's say for example, at the moment every note here is an 8th note. When this sounds, we hear boom, boom. When we turn on a ratchet, we're going to hear something more like boom. You hear we're hearing 2 notes in the same space as 1 note. And we can change this so it has a value of 2 notes in the space of 1 note, or 3 notes in the space of 1 note, or 4 notes in the space of 1 note. Here we jump around from one pattern to another. And there's various things that we can do in here or in here, I can't remember which one, to change how this behaves. I'll show you those in a minute. Let's put it back to pattern 2 for now. So first I want to just show you one of the possible things that you can do. Because with these kind of things, I mean, if you bring in too much change and too much randomness, it can just sound like trash, right? So one thing that I like to do is get a few instances of this going, either going into either triggering the same instrument or different instruments, doesn't matter, and leave a few of them to behave in a pretty repetitive way, and then take maybe one of them and play around with it to make it do a lot of different things. And that way we've got the repetitive things given a nice kind of foundation, given a nice backbone, but we've also got a lot of variety then coming in on top of that. This, I think, is a very musical way to use these things. So let's see how that can sound. So let me bring in okay, so let's just see what these are doing. Okay, they're just going forwards. Yeah, also just going forwards. Alright, these are pretty repetitive, so let's let them do this repetitive thing. I think I'll change it over to pipa again. Nice. So now let's play around with this a little bit. So let me try skipping something. So I'll skip, for example, one of the actual played notes and a rest. So you see, that's not that musical, right? It doesn't sound that good. So these skips are the kind of thing that you need to use judiciously, and you need to kind of think what you're doing and plan it properly. The end can be a cool one. You know, we can make it really short, and then we just suddenly get this very repetitive part. It can be like a nice breakdown or something, and then we can make it longer again. And then we can try and make polyrhythms. So we can change this to, for example, a 9-step pattern. And again, this is something that might sound good or it might sound terrible. But let's change it. Let me just make it let me try a 12-step pattern. That might have more chance of sounding good. Let's see. Not bad. Let's see what it's like as a 9-step pattern. Pretty good. I like that. Okay, let me put it back to an 8-step pattern. So let's change the speed. So here we're slowing it down. Forgot to turn off my Wi-Fi, please forgive me. Here I'll speed it up, 16th notes. So obviously this can be cool to play with live. Direction's fun to play with. So let's say we do random and speed it up. Sounds a bit weird. Let's try resyncing and see if that makes it sound better. This is just too fast for this, doesn't sound great. Slow it down again. Let's try the ratchets. Too fast. Ratchet's not sounding great on this. Let's try this on this bell. Sounds cooler on this. So a lot of what you do is going to depend on what you're playing. This is set to random, it's a bit too crazy. Let's change it to forwards. So these two patterns don't go particularly well together. So obviously when you're trying to do, I forgot to bring off these ones, right? Obviously when you're trying to switch around between different patterns, I think actually when I played with those earlier, they sounded good when I didn't have the other stuff running in the background. But with stuff running in the background, one of those patterns sounds good, the other one less so. Now, let's see. Okay, let's look at this window. Okay, so we have three tabs here. Midi Sync, that's this bottom one that's open at the moment, Sequence, and Sliders. Let's look at Sliders first. So here we choose our key and scale. In terms of scale, we have major, minor, pentatonic, and chromatic, just all the notes. Wouldn't mind seeing more scales in this, but we can, of course, use an app like Bramboss's Rosetta Scaler to quantize the notes to a scale. I won't go into that in this video. You can watch the two-part video that I did on Bramboss Rosetta Suite, and I showed how to use Scaler in this way in that video. I want to limit the size of this video. There's a lot to go through in this app. So I would like to see more scales here, but it's not a big deal for me that it doesn't have a wide choice of scales, because I'll just use Rosetta Scaler to do that. But this is one thing that could be improved in this app. Now here we have our octaves. So let's listen to this. So now we're on the second octave. Bring it down to the first. Now we're up on the fifth octave. Now, of course, one thing you could do is, if you know what you're doing, I mean, play around with these in real time. Now, what else we got here on this screen, on this tab? So here is an overall length slider. Let me bring that octave down. Let's change this to length. You see how this is like a master slider for all of those? So of course we can use the master slider and then we can go in and change the values of individual ones. Sometimes when you change a value of one of these, it'll automatically snap back to a certain value. It might seem like a bug, but what I think it is that the value you set on one step is incompatible with the value that you set on another step. Something I'd need to spend a bit more time with maybe to be able to reproduce that for you, but I've noticed that kind of behavior and I think it's not a bug. Here, master velocity slider. Now here we can randomize the length and the velocity. This often sounds better with smaller amounts of randomization. And these will still control the upper limits, I think, of the randomization. Now, on the right here is where we choose what the probability sliders will control the probability of. This is very important. So we have a choice between controlling the probability of ratcheting, controlling the probability of skipped steps, controlling the probability of reset, the sequence resetting, and controlling the probability of mute. And what we can also use the probability sliders for is to send out MIDI CC values. So we can control parameters in other apps, for example, by sending out CC values from this. So this is very important to pay attention to because the behavior of the probability sliders will change a lot. Now, one thing I mentioned to Art, the developer, is that I don't like, and I have to say I really don't like it, the fact that we have to choose between these. Because what it means is that I can't adjust, I can't, for example, reduce the probability of a note being played and have ratchet probability at the same time. I've got to choose one. And then if I change from one to the other, like if, for example, if I'm doing ratchets and then I decide that I want to have fewer steps, if I then change to probability skip, the ratchets will just disappear completely. So what I said to Art, and I'm sure that a lot of users would like to see this, why can't we have simultaneous different types of probability going on? So that would maybe need a small UI change, but I think it would be extremely useful and popular with users. But I want to mention that I feel that one of the most important things is probability skip. But what you can do is you can use his app MIDI steps to do that instead. So you can use MIDI steps to control probability. And that way you could have, for example, ratcheting or reset or mute or whatever. Sorry, not to control skip. You can use MIDI steps to control muting. So yeah, there's a kind of workaround, but it's not ideal. Okay, so that's these. Now then here, sequence. So here we've got the direction sliders and so on, but as we saw, when the window is open large, we have these anyway. And we have these note speed things, right? So there are some elements of the UI that can be accessed in different ways. It depends on the size of the window, whether you see those on the main screen as well or not. This part here, increment steps, this we normally just leave like this. But let's imagine, for example, you want to control the velocity of the steps in MidiDREAMs using another app. Let's say you want to use MIDI LFOs, for example, to control the velocity. Then you just deselect this, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow that external app full control over changing the velocity of this. This is a bit technical. Not all listeners will get this. You can check the manual it has the information about this if that's not clear enough to you. May need to read it several times. I know I did. So that's what this does. And then here, this again, quite technical. If you don't understand my explanation, just go and read it in the manual. There are some things that really are a bit tricky to explain and maybe need to be read to be fully grasped. But basically, the way the app normally works, the sliders for probability, velocity, length, and so on, these things will all run in sync. Like when the velocity step is on its first step, the length step will also be on its first step, and so on. But if we choose clock, we can unlink those so they will run on different sequences. If lock is pressed, then they will all run on the same sequence. They'll all be on the first step at the same time, second step at the same time, and so on and so on. And then the incremental one, this is really quite technical. I'll leave you to look at the manual to get that yourself. Now here, ratchet lock, okay, we've talked about that already, I think. This is where we control ratchet speed, so how many ratchets will we get. So when it's like this, let's say, for example, we have a value of a quarter note. Let's say that's what we set back. Where do we set that? Over here, right, okay. So let's say we've set a quarter note here. If we set ratchet to 2, then when we turn on the ratchet, we're going to get 2 eighth notes in the space of 1 quarter note. If we set the ratchet to 3, that quarter note is going to be divided into 3 shorter notes. Here it's going to be divided into 4, right? So that's what that does. Then here, we've got our swing amount. This is one of these things that doesn't show a value. The app is a little bit inconsistent in that, because some sliders do show values. Actually, I think just the ones in the main screen. But all the sliders in this, they don't show any values when they're changed. I think they should show their values, really. But I believe that when the swing is like this, that's basically 50% value, which means no swing. So if we want to get swing, we just add this. Okay. I probably don't want to add too much. Might get a bit too extreme. So, okay. Let's go to the next one. MIDI and sync. This first part is simple enough. This is just the MIDI out channel. Here we've got a panic button in case we've got stuck notes. Now, this part is pretty important, and I'll try and make it clear. If it's not clear, again, I would refer you to the manual. This is really important and really, really cool part, actually. So here we can change our trigger from clock to gate. And I'm going to show you this in a minute, but first I'm going to explain it to you. I'll probably have to jump out to another session maybe to show you this. So when clock is set, it's going to move from one step to the next step just by following the BPM set by the host, right? But if we choose gate, instead, what we can do is we can use input notes to send the signal that we wanted to move on a step. So, for example, we could set it up so that when I play with, I can just show you this actually using the keyboard here. So let me set this to gate, and here also let me choose gate. I'll explain this in a second. So let me see what's happening here. Hang on. Okay, there we go. So you see now, when I press on the AUM keyboard, that is moving it forward a step. So we can use this in really creative ways. It's one of the things I like also about the manual that he explains things like this. It's something I maybe wouldn't have thought of. So for example, you can set up 2 instances of MidiDREAMs, or as many as you like. And you could use one of those instances to send in the MIDI into the second one. The first one you could set to clock, so it will just follow the BPM and just go forward in an orderly manner. The second one you could set to gate, and you could send the MIDI from the first one into the second one. Then when the second one received notes from the first one, the sequence would move forwards. So that can be really, really, really interesting to play with. Now, if when it's set to gate, any MIDI note will move it forward a step. When it's set to control, you need to use a certain MIDI note. I forget what it is, the details are in the manual, to move it forward. If you set it to through, then it's just gonna play the notes that you play on the keyboard. So they're not actually gonna do anything to the sequence. So most of the time, most people are gonna want to have this on clock. This is where you can set up program change input. Again, a bit technical. The details are in the manual if you're interested in that. Now, next section is important. So this controls what will happen when we change from one pattern to another. If you remember, we do that by just pressing these pattern buttons, right, to jump from one pattern to another. We have those here when it's, or no, here, this is just for the steps. Yeah, that's not showing us the patterns. So we'll only see those patterns when it's big screen. So when I press this 2, is it going to change immediately? What exactly is the behavior going to be? All of that is going to depend on what we set up in here. So if we press it to step, we have step, jump, end, and bar. So if we press step, when I press, for example, if I have it on pattern 1 and then I press 2, it will immediately change to pattern 2 as soon as I press number 2, and pattern 2 will start from its first step. If jump is selected when I press pattern 2, when I'm on pattern 1 and then I press the button to go to pattern 2, it will jump immediately to that, and it will preserve its position in the step order. Let me explain. For example, if pattern 1 is on step 5 and I press jump, it's going to change to pattern 2, and pattern 2 is going to begin from step 5. It's not going to begin from step 1. So that's jump. So that's the difference between step and jump. If end is selected, the pattern will change, but it will wait until pattern 1 has finished before it changes to pattern 2. If bar is selected, then it will change at a certain bar division dependent on what we've set here. For example, if we set this to 1 bar and this to bar, when I change from pattern 1 to pattern 2, it's going to wait until the beginning of the next bar to do it. If I have this selected, it's going to change at the next quarter note. If this is selected, it's going to change at the next 4-bar transition, for example, first bar, 5th bar, 9th bar, and so on. Here it's going to wait until the end of a 16-bar pattern. So let's see those in action. So let's show you first. So here, let's do this one. So here, when I change, it's going to wait and change at the next 4-bar division. And you can see it tells you how long it's going to take. It helps you to see when it's going to come in. Right, so you get the idea. I'm not going to show you all of those. Well, maybe I'll show you the step and jump. I'll show you the difference between those. So it's now set to step. So what should happen now, if everything goes according to plan, which it often doesn't with MIDI sequencers, when I press 2, it's going to change to pattern 2 immediately, and it's going to start from step 1 of pattern 2. And you can see that is what happened. And those are rest notes. If I choose jump, now it's going to change pattern, but it's going to preserve its step position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it on, let's say, step 5. And then it should... Right, see? It was on step 5 of the other pattern. So that's how that works. This nano mode, there's something in the manual that's referring to nano control. But unfortunately it says something like, this information will be added to the manual later. So currently the manual is actually a bit incomplete. I mean, the manual, as I said earlier, is extremely detailed, but there are a few things that have not been put in yet that I don't know when will be added. So, okay. Now we'll look at this tools section. So here again, we've got some things that we have access to in other places if the window is large, like this double pattern thing, or shift pattern. So here actually, this one is not available somewhere else, I think, is it? So here we can shift the pattern forwards or backwards, or we can shift it up or down. Now, the manual actually says that this will shift up or down by 1 semitone, but in fact it is by octave. This is a change that Art decided to make because he felt it was more useful, but he forgot to change it in the manual. Okay, so you can see here the way the pattern is shifting over, excuse me, to the right. And here you can see it going up an octave or down an octave. Now here we can clear our pattern. So either we can clear just pitch or just velocity, just length, just probability, or clear all of them. Here, this is again another resync button, I think. We got our panic button again. And then here we can also copy and paste. So this is a very useful thing. So let's say you have a pattern, let's call it pattern 1, and you want to make a pattern 2, and you want it to just be a small variation on pattern 1. Well, instead of going in and trying to remember exactly the way pattern 1 was set up and so on, all you have to do is copy pattern 1, or copy any particular aspect of it that you want, and then you go in to pattern 2 and paste it. So again, we can copy just the pitch, just the velocity settings, just the length, just the probability sliders, or we can copy all of those. So let's just do that now. So I'll copy all and then close this. And then here, let me click on 3 now, pattern 3. So pattern 3, we haven't set anything up. Then I go to Tools, and here I select Paste, and you can see that that pattern has been pasted in. So this is very cool. Okay, let me let you hear an example of using one instance of MidiDREAMs on clock input mode and the other one on gate mode, receiving MIDI from the other instance, the one that's on clock mode. So this is really one of the coolest features of this sequencer, and I think for a lot of people it will be worth buying for this alone. There's a real need for a sequencer that does this. So if we have our different instances here, you can see if I click on this routing matrix, it's a very complex setup that I've got going on here. I'm not going to try and explain everything about it, but all I want to mention is this first instance of MidiDREAMs is set to clock, right? So that is why you can see it is moving forward from one step to the next step in a totally orderly manner. It is an 8th note per step, and that's it. There's no variation in that. I'll let you hear this in a second, by the way. If you look at this one is set to gate. I've got to let this do stuff first. Hang on. So if you look at this one, first of all, it's moving backwards. Okay, that's one thing. But notice that the time it takes for it to move from one step to another is varying, right? It's not completely predictable like the last one. That's because here, the signal that tells it to move from one step to another is not coming from the clock. It's not coming from the host transport. It's coming from the MIDI that is going into it. And I'm actually sending MIDI into it from 2 different instances of MidiDREAMs, this one and this one. So that can give a lot of variety, bring an unpredictable but orderly element to sequences. So you can set up a whole bunch of different instances of the app, and you can set some of them to clock, some of them to gate input, and play around with them in all kinds of ways. But I do want to mention there does still seem to be a bug where when you save a session, what has happened to me every time I've tried this, when I try to save with gate selected in both of these, when I then reopen the session, it's not saved like that. This has changed to control. So I've notified the developer about this. So be careful if you save a session and you open it up and you had it saved as using the gate as your MIDI note input, and then you find that it's not making any sound, it's because it has switched over to this one. Okay, let's look at MidiDRUMs. So MidiDRUMs, here I'm using the session that I used earlier, but I switched out Rousemaker and put Ting instead. Did a video on this, really nice little percussion app. Let me just pause the transport a second. Do remember, of course, everybody, that if you're not running the transport, nothing's going to happen, right? With these sequencing apps, you've got to have play pressed in your host. So this box at the top is an important one. If you click into this and go down to the bottom tab, Configure Kit, you can see that configuration setups are here already for some popular drum machines like Rousemaker FM, Fractal Bits, and so on. But there may also be things that are not here. For example, Drum Computer is not here. So if you want to set up Drum Computer, you're going to have to check in the manual, for example, or check using the AUM keyboard or another keyboard to try and trigger different things and figure out what notes are triggering different drums. It's kind of a pain in the ass with drum sequencers having to do that. So yeah, anyway, if your thing is here, it's going to be a lot easier for you to use the setting that's here. So choosing Ting. And so then here, what we'll see is different tags that help us to remember the name of the sound that's being generated. And then here we can see what MIDI notes are used to trigger those different things and what channels are being used and so on. So again, you've got the custom thing here if you need to set up your own things. Now also in this thing, we have other things like in the MIDI and Sync tab, our default MIDI out channel. Then we've got here the different types of sync for when we change patterns. I covered this in MidiDRUMs, I won't talk about it again. Here we can change the time value in beats of every step of the sequence. Panic button. Then we've got again this clock trigger and gate trigger. I talked about this in MidiDREAMs part of this video. I won't cover it again. Program change section down here as well. Then here, sequencer tab. Okay, again, we've got our speed. We've got the swing value. So if it's 50, there's no swing. Then here we've got a global length control. That's probably not important if you're controlling drums, but if you're controlling synths, this will determine how soon after a note on, a note off is sent. Then here, we've got velocity and random velocity sliders and random CC value sliders. I covered these in my last, in the last section on MidiDREAMs, so again, I won't go over those. Just here, please be aware that these are related to, this is for that particular percussive instrument in Ting. This is for that one. I forget the names of some of these. Then MIDI and Sync tab. Okay, yeah, sequencer, right. So that's us covered basically with this section. Let's click out of that. Tools. Okay, again, all things that were covered in the part about MidiDREAMs. Again, some things are repeated on the main screen if we have the interface large size, like the sequence speed and the trigger type and so on. Now here we've got our patterns to switch between different patterns. Again, all stuff I talked about in the part on MidiDREAMs. Now here, this is important. So notice this is red and this is red and this is red, right? Art is really good at, his interfaces are beautiful. I love Art Kerns interfaces. My God, I love them so much. Thank you, Art, for making these beautiful apps. Beautiful and very functional and very clear and lovely, nice size, not a strain on the eyes. Really important, this, everybody. Some developers just make apps that are just such a strain on your eyes, even if your eyes are good. If your eyes are not, then you're really in trouble. Okay, so here, this is controlling the velocity of these steps for this sound. If I click here, now it's for this sound. And we can, let me just press play. So I can mute that. You see that's just been muted there. If I click this again, now it's unmuted. Here I can more gradually control the velocity. Trying to see, yeah, I can add notes also here. That's quite nice, a little bit slightly more reggae vibe there if we put a bit more swing on it maybe. So we can also do that for probability. For example here, so I've brought the probability down to 0, so that note is never going to be played. If I put it up here, there's a 50% probability it'll be played. Nice. So obviously we change these for different sounds in here. And what we can also do is we can quickly mute all instances of any individual sound by clicking here. So now all we have is these two sounds. Right, so this is muting all instances of a particular sound. When we play around here, we have more control over individual ones. So this clicking here is a bit more of a global one, and this is a more per step control. And that's all there is to it, right? Everything else you understand if you already understand MidiDREAMs. So, just a quick summary then. MidiDRUMs and MidiDREAMs, really, really like them. What do I like? I love the interfaces. Love the interfaces. I love the choice of gate as a trigger. Again, go back and watch the earlier part of the video where I talked about that if you want to understand why that is such a useful and cool thing. And I just find his interfaces very enjoyable to use. I really enjoy interacting with the sliders and stuff. You know, everything just feels really, really nice. What would I say? Couple of little bugs here and there. I do feel that the apps could have had a bit more beta testing, but hopefully things will get sorted out soon. What else do I like about it? Very detailed manual. In some ways, if you are more experienced, it might actually be kind of too detailed because there's a lot of stuff that you know that you don't really need. But particularly if you're newer to the platform or newer to MIDI and stuff like that, tons of stuff in there. And it's just, the manual is just written with love and a lot of attention to detail. So I really appreciate that. I feel that Art is someone who thinks deeply about his apps, really takes a lot of care with the interface and different little details of the app that create a great user experience. So I'm a fan of his stuff, definitely. All right, everyone. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Have a good one.